Now we're talking about Paul going back to Jerusalem and going and participating in the fulfillment of a Nazirite vow. And that's no doubt that's what he did. Now we're talking about whether he was in the will of God to do it or out. And I told you it's a very confusing, issue. But one of the things you can think about is this. What did Paul himself take in Acts chapter 18? A Nazirite vow, didn't he? A Nazirite vow was a vow of thankfulness. Now what harm is there in that? There's no harm. Where the issue comes in is part of that Nazirite vow was there would be a cleansing and then there'd be a sacrifice, and it's called a sin offering. And look, that's an issue, isn't it? But one of the things I don't know if y'all noticed was when you read in Acts, and we'll go back there a minute, it says that Paul went through with this until that an offering should be made. So the offering never was made. So whether Paul wasn't going to do it or whether God just intervened and stopped it, it's kind of a moot point. Okay? But let's read what Paul said in 1 Corinthians 9. He says, verse 19, "For though I be free from all men, yet have I made myself servant unto all that I might gain the more." Now he says, look, I belong to Christ. I serve no man, and yet I've made myself a slave to all men. He said, unto the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. What in the world's he talking about? When he was around Jews, he acted like a Jew. He said, to them that are under the law, as under the law. Now it's hard to get around this. Did Paul act as if he was under the law when he was around those that were under the law? He did. He said that I might gain them that are under the law. Why did he do these things? So he could witness to them, so he could share the gospel with them. Now, what would it mean that he acted as if he were under the law? Folks, he did what they were doing under their law. He went along with it, didn't he? You and I can't exactly make this claim today, and I'll show y'all why. Anything that you and I would make the claim of, we would be missing the mark, because Paul was doing something that God had instructed those people to do. And during that period of time, it was still being done. I'm not saying there was any efficacy in it, but it was still shadowing the work of Christ, wasn't it? See, Christ had come, and what Paul said is, quit doing the shadows, you've got the real thing. But for a group of people that didn't know that, there was still some value in the shadows, wasn't there? How come you and I can't just make this claim and do it? We're number one, we're not Jewish. Number two, there is no sanctified Jewish religion today. It can't be kept. It's impossible. And no priesthood, no multitude of reasons. But how about you can't come out of some Gentile pagan custom and then claim that you're going to go back and keep Gentile pagan customs? Paul didn't say to the pagans, I became as a pagan. Watch what he did say. He says, 21, to them that are without law, as without law, being not without law to God, but under the law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without the law. In other words, he said, to the Jew, I became as a Jew. To the Gentile, I became as a Gentile. But he never said to the pagan, I became as a pagan. In other words, would Paul have gone in and took place in the pagan ceremonies and prostitutes and all that to help a pagan get saved? Because that's absolutely contrary to God's will, isn't it? God never sanctioned those things. Well, you and I, in the same manner of speaking, can't do certain things in order to... In other words, if a group of guys said, I'm going to go rob a bank tomorrow, and I said, well, I'm going to go rob it with you, and then I told y'all I only robbed it so I could preach the gospel to them. You can't do that. And number one, that's stupid, but number two, and I'm taking it too far overboard, but just back it up some. Right? What can we do and what do we not do? Look, I'll tell y'all, I come out of, a religion that practices a lot of traditions. And some of those traditions are just that. They're traditions, and there's no harm in them. We were never told to do it, and there's no harm in them. And therefore, when I'm around those people, to keep from offending them, if there's certain traditions they do, I'll go along with it. But it's not that you're underwriting it. You're just not being an offense. I went to a funeral recently, and I stayed at the funeral at the place. I walked in. I was polite, did everything they wanted. I walked in, but when it got right down to the point that they were about to begin the ceremony, which I knew what it was going to be, I told the person, I said, I need to go. I can't stay. And the person said, well, why not? This is my home. I said, yes, it's your home. It's not mine. I can stay right up until the point, but I can't stay for a sacrifice. Because that's what they were about to offer. Whether they know it or not, they're going to offer a sacrifice. there's no way to put it in different terms. Look, it was loved ones. I love them, and I want to share the gospel with them. And what it actually turned out to be was an opportunity to share the gospel. Because the person said, sacrifice. And I said, well, you don't realize it, but that's what's about to happen. And I said, but I've already got a sacrifice. Jesus Christ died to pay for my sins. So you see, in my opinion, that trip was worth it, wasn't it? And again, you just go through these things. And lots of times you'll go through various customs and whatnot. And like I said, I'd have Lexi wear a dress at a certain place. Or if I went to a different, you know that there's a church in Grand Bay that you got to wear a cowboy hat if you're a guy? Yeah. It's a cowboy church. And go, I mean, that's strange to me, but that, you know. Well, I tell y'all what, if they asked me to come preach the gospel, I'd go in a heartbeat to preach the gospel to them, and I'd get me a cowboy hat. I mean, I've been needing one anyway, right, Lexi? But you see, I'm just trying to show y'all.
Is that when in Rome, do as a Roman?
Yeah, it is. But when in Rome, you do as a Romans up until a point. We do not break God's direct commands. We do not do what God commanded not to do, and we don't not do what God commanded to do. We draw the line there, don't we? But as far as this Nazirite vow, what was it hurting? Nothing. And I tend to think that Paul was in the will of God. But again, I'm not going to argue. Whether he was or not, God made sure it didn't come to that sacrifice, because it says God brought it to an end. How did he bring it to an end? They come running in there and grab Paul and arrest him, and he's in jail for years, isn't he? Okay, so again, that's how it was carried out. Let's see. All right, the conditions in Jerusalem. Let's talk briefly about this. Flip back over to Acts. Let's read how he says it. Y'all know it's a very confusing thing for a person today who believes the gospel, believes the Word of God, and has trusted Christ. It's hard to understand the role of the law in the life of a Christian, because at some point you read things that say it almost seems like we need to run from the law, and at another point it seems like, hey, we need to keep the law. If you don't make the distinction between God's law and Moses' law, you're going to get in some confusion. Okay? We don't need Moses' law anymore, because Moses' law is moot. I've used this example before, but one time I was asked to build a pool over off of Cody Road. A guy bought, you know, the guy with that theater there now and all? He bought that big old piece of property. They told me at that time he was the richest man in Alabama. I don't know if that's true, but he got rich with some kind of computer software in hospitals or something, right? But he bought that huge tract of land and built this massive, and it looked more like some kind of a church he was building in a home. But anyway, he had this big elaborate fountain and a big creek and all kind of, it was a real elaborate job. But I went to look at it, and they called me to go to bid it. And when I got there, the thing that impressed me so much, it was so much like a construction job site, like commercial. They had a trailer there. You don't have a trailer at a house, you just, right? They had a construction trailer where everybody sat, and when I went in there, there's the contractor, there's the architect, and there's, you know, the other guys. But the architect had made a scale model of the whole property. And I mean, look, you know, little boys like models, and there I walk in, I seen that thing, it was impressive. I mean, it took a lot of work. And I'm looking at that model, and I'm blown away. He had little people, bushes, I mean, he had it all, right? And so we started talking about it, and finally we got to the point where I needed to know about the elevation. Now, the model he had was flat. He didn't have all the elevations, right? So I need to know the difference between where my pumps are going and where the water's at. Now, that's important to know what you got to do for head pressure and whatnot, okay? So I needed to know. And the guy's on there trying to explain on the drawing. He's digging through. He's got a little laser pointer, and I mean, they're having a full-blown meeting about this and digging in the file cabinets and all, and I'm thinking, it's right out there, right? Finally, I said, hey, guys, why don't I just step outside for a minute and look? No, we're going to get it. We're going to get it. He was so in love with his model that he wanted to use the model. Why use the model when the job's 90% done? I don't need the model anymore. I've got the real thing right outside. So while they were going through all of that, I said, well, y'all excuse me. I went outside, and I walked over where the pump's going to go, and I squatted down on the ground, and I looked like that, and I said, okay, and I come back in, and that was the end of it. They're still digging at the model. They were still focused on the shadow when the real thing's outside. That's Moses' law. It's not God's law. God's law is a description of God's righteousness and what God requires from man. God requires obedience, doesn't He? How does He make that obedience known? The 10 Commandments. And you can sum them up. Jesus Christ summed them up in 2. The first stone is love God with all your heart, soul, mind, and strength. The second one is love your neighbor as yourself. Does anyone in here want to make the claim for that today? I can't do it. Even if I could do it from today forward, and I can't, what about yesterday? I've already broke that. And so that law was never given as a means of saving me. It was given as a means of letting me know I can't meet the righteousness God requires. Therefore, I better find someone to meet it for me. Who met it? Christ. You know, Christ had His active and His passive obedience, and this is very important. His passive obedience was right here. What did He do passively? He was born under the law, submitted to it, and kept every single regulation. I mean, every jot and tittle He kept it, didn't He? Right up until He hung on the cross, and the last thing He did was He passively gave His life. He let them crucify Him, didn't He? But then, I'm doing this wrong. Let me put it here. His active obedience was His performance. In other words, passively, He surrendered. He put Himself under the law. He subjected Himself to it. Actively, He kept every precept. He did everything. He kept the law, and yet at the same time became the curse of the law. He was our expiation and our propitiation. He met God's demands. And so when we put His passive obedience together with His active obedience, what does a person have who, instead of being judged by their own performance, is judged by Christ's performance? Then what is their performance marked as? Righteous. Why? Because he lived a perfect life of righteousness, and actively He did it all. His test score on your paper, that's salvation. It's trusting Christ and not me. Now, Paul here is entering into Jerusalem. And in Acts 21, notice again what it says. Verse 20. When they heard it, Paul and them's testimony, what had been going on, they glorified the Lord, and they said unto him, Thou seest, brother, how many thousands of Jews there are which believe, and they are all zealous of the law. Now, which law is meant here? Law of Moses. That's not a good thing. It's not a strictly good thing that they're all zealous of Moses' law. Now, I say that because of this. What would the tendency be for the Jew if he didn't begin to break clear of Moses' law? To go back into trusting it, right? This was never going to happen out among the Gentiles. The Gentile tendency would have been to antinomianism, lawlessness, because we all run back to mama, so to speak. But the Jews in Jerusalem, what would have been the main danger that they faced after they became Christians? To go back to relying on the law. The book of Hebrews was written for what purpose? That purpose. You know, we don't know who wrote Hebrews. Some people swear it was Paul, some swear it wasn't. We don't know. We know the Holy Spirit of God wrote it, okay? But one of the things I can picture in my mind is Paul sitting in jail after this happened. Boy, that would have been the perfect time to write it, wouldn't it? What's he telling the Christian Jew who's believed? Don't you understand what the law is? It's a shadow. And he goes through all the points, doesn't he? Showing this was a shadow, that was a shadow. And what's he keep telling them to do? Turn from the shadow and worship the real thing. Now, he never commanded anybody to quit keeping their traditions. Okay? Nations have traditions, and you know, we don't like to lose them. We like to remain our distinct people. We like our heritage, and the Jew was no different. So the Jew didn't want to give up his traditions, and Paul never told him to do so, did he? But he warned them of the danger of traditions. Isn't there a big danger in traditions? What did the Jews basically do with the law through their tradition according to Jesus? They made the law of no effect. Okay? They rendered the law useless by their traditions. All right? These Jews now are suspicious of Paul. Notice what it says again. Verse 21. And they, this is the believing Jew now, not the unbeliever, they are informed of thee some whispering campaign, that thou teachest all the Jews which are among the Gentiles to forsake Moses, saying that they ought not to circumcise their children, neither to walk after the customs. Did Paul ever teach a Jewish believer not to circumcise? He never said that. He taught the Gentile believers, don't be circumcised to be righteous. Remember that? Go back to Galatians 5. All right, in Galatians 5, verse 1, he says, stand fast therefore in the liberty wherewith Christ hath made us free, and be not entangled again with the yoke of bondage. Now, to be entangled is to be caught up, isn't it? With a yoke of bondage. What's he telling them? Don't let yourself be drawn back under bondage. Well, watch next. Behold, I, Paul, say unto you, that if you be circumcised, these Gentiles in Galatia, Christ shall profit you nothing. Now, what's he mean by this? I mean, is he saying Christ won't reward you at all for the circumcision? No. He said if you get tricked and you get led to begin putting your trust in circumcision, then it's going to be the next Jewish thing and the next Jewish thing, and you're no longer going to be trusting Christ, you're going to be trusting your performance. So he says in verse 3, for I testify again to every man that is circumcised, he is a debtor to do the whole law. Now he's not saying every circumcised person's got to keep Moses' law. He's saying to the Galatians, any of you Gentiles that get circumcised because you believe it is necessary for salvation, you've quit trusting Christ. You're now trusting your works. Well, now what do you have to do? You got to keep the whole law. I mean, y'all see how that it's just what James 2:10 says, whosoever keeps all the law and offends in one point, offends in all. He says, Christ is become of no effect unto you, whosoever you are justified from the law, by the law, you are fallen from grace. Now, could a saved person, a Gentile, in Galatia get circumcised and lose his salvation? That's contrary to everything the Scripture teaches. What does it mean to fall from grace then? People teach it means to lose your salvation. Folks, you cannot lose your salvation because you didn't do anything to earn it. Christ saved you and he didn't make a mistake. In his foreknowledge, he knows what he's doing. Anytime a person falls from grace, there's only one place they can fall to: law. Because they're going from trusting Christ's work back unto trusting their own. And when you fall from grace, you fall under law. It doesn't matter what the law is. Moses' law, it could be different, Mormon law, it could be any law, it doesn't matter. What he's saying here is, don't believe that you are saved by any work of your flesh. Your flesh and the Jews' flesh, there's no difference. All need the same thing. It's not circumcision. All need a Savior. And this is what he's teaching them. Now, again, for the Gentiles, I suspect this would have been a very glorious doctrine. Look, if I had been in Galatia, I'd have been thrilled to hear this, wouldn't you? I mean, come on, who wants to go through this as an adult? But for the Jew, what is it? It strikes at the custom. They do it to their 8-year-old boys. Look, it's the same today, you could say, with dedicating a child to the Lord. Having a child christened or having a child, baptized or whatever. People will fight and argue over this tooth and nail. Folks, you cannot prove the mode of baptism by the Bible. The mode's not important. What's important is it's a sign for the person. It's a sign that points them to Christ and what he's done for them. But when people dedicate a baby, what good would it do for you to go fight with them and tell them, you shouldn't do that, you can't do that? None. Any more than it would do for you to fight with your neighbor telling him he's got to do it. Right? It's a custom, isn't it? Then what should you do? Let him do his custom. Really, let him do it. Now, where do you draw the line? When they teach baptismal regeneration. Because lots of people are teaching that. Whole religions teach that that child is saved by being baptized. No, stop. Put your foot down. Say, you're not going to baptize my child if that's what you mean. But when it's just a custom, dedicating a child or even baptizing a child, saying we believe that we're trusting God's going to bring them into the covenant, just like they circumcise children. It's not hurting a thing. It's things, the word is adiaphorous. I don't know if y'all have ever heard that. That's what the old-timers would call this doctrine. Things adiaphorous. Here, I'll give you the definition. Adiaphorous means things indifferent. They're neutral. They're neither right nor beneficial, but they're neither wrong nor harmful. Hear that? They're neither right nor beneficial, but they're not wrong or harmful. What's the harm? What was the harm in Paul going in there? And basically what he did was he had to go through a cleansing ceremony for him. He didn't take the Nazirite vow, although he took one in chapter 18. What he had to do was he himself had to be purified on the third day and then again on the seventh day. And that's because where had he been? Out with the Gentiles. So according to the Jews, what was he? Ceremonially unclean. So Paul said, no problem. You want me to wash in your ceremonies? I'll wash. After all, Paul himself said we need to wash ourselves from sin, doesn't he? He said we need to purify ourselves from it. That means wash. In other words, we do. But the point being is this. Paul was purified to partake in that ceremony with them. And what he was going to do was he was going to pay for their sacrifices. You got to remember, these are the poor saints at Jerusalem. So by paying for their sacrifices, what's he basically showing the people? I'm not teaching against these customs. I'm telling nobody anywhere to quit being a Jew. I'm not telling anybody anywhere that your traditions are bad. He was not teaching against that. Does that make sense what he did and why he did it? What was Paul's main reason for being in Jerusalem? Even before that, he had a better reason. Y'all remember what he's been writing about all this time? An offering. He's taken up an offering for the poor saints in Jerusalem from the Gentiles. What do y'all think in Paul's mind that was going to do? He was going to bring them together. That's what Paul's looking for, unity. And with that in mind, as he comes there, he knows what people are saying about him. He's coming there with a big gathering of help, right? And by the way, it wasn't just their regular weekly offerings to make the work of God possible. This was a special collection. They took it up. Y'all know we've done it several times. When somebody's in bad need, what do? I'll tell you, hey, you know, so-and-so, let's get together and do what we can here. And this is what he did. And he took it back and he gave it to them. He's showing them there is no hostility in the Gentile Christian church towards the Jewish church. But you couldn't say the opposite anymore. Now, why? Because the Jews felt like they were losing their grip. Look, what had been the center of God's religion? Judaism. Can't y'all see how they felt like they were losing their importance and their prominence? And they were. But that's right, because what's happening? The gospel is going to move from Jerusalem into all the world, isn't it? So Paul went back there, and the whole idea he's got in his mind is unity. Now, doesn't it make sense why he went ahead and went along with that? Yeah. If his conscience had told him this is wrong, Paul would have been wrong to do it. Obviously, Paul's conscience didn't tell him it was wrong. You're never safe to act against your conscience. Y'all know even if something is not sin, if it's sin and you do it, it's sin. Whether your conscience says it is or not, it's sin. It doesn't matter, okay? But if something is not a sin and you do that thing thinking it's a sin, you're sinning. Make sense? Well, why? Because if you think it's not God's will for me to do this, whether it's God's will or not, if you think it's not and you do it, what are you doing? You're acting against God. You're rebelling. Look, if I told the kids, don't eat, hey, y'all can't eat any fruit. No fruit, right? And Sienna sneaks in there and eats an apple. Now think about it. Is she going against my will? Yes, she's breaking it. What if I say no fruit and she goes in there and eats a tomato and thinks it's fruit? I didn't say anything about vegetables, did I? But to her, what's she doing? She's disobeying me. You see, it's that way. And Paul talks about the weaker brother. So one more passage. Y'all go to Romans 14. Hey, Lexi, you want to go ahead and get the stuff? All right, Romans 14:1, y'all watch. Paul says, him that is weak in the faith. Now, he doesn't mean physically. He means a new believer or somebody that's not very strong in the faith. Him that is weak in the faith receive ye, but not to doubtful disputations. That doesn't mean, I had a man tell me once, me and Wayne in a Sunday school class told me, he said, he took me to that verse because I asked a question. And he said, see there, we'll let you in here, but don't be asking no questions. That's not what the verse means. The verse means you receive them, but not to beat them over the head and show your knowledge, you know, and lord over them. He said, for one believeth that he may eat all things. Can we eat all things? Yeah. He said, another who is weak eateth herbs. Who's the weaker brother? The one that doesn't think he can eat everything. He said, let not him that eateth despise him that eateth not, and let not him which eateth not judge him that eateth, for God hath received him. What he's saying is the stronger brother needs to show kindness to the weaker brother. In the case of the Jews in Jerusalem and Paul, who was the weaker brother? The Jews in Jerusalem. They still had some tie or some, I don't know, they had more confidence in the traditions, and Paul had a further knowledge that they don't mean anything. So what did Paul do? Lord it over them? No. Instead he said, look, weaker brother. Now he goes on. Who art thou that judgest another man's servant? To his own master he standeth or falleth, yea, he shall be holden up, for God is able to make him stand. One man esteemeth one day above another, another esteemeth every day alike. Let every man be fully persuaded in his own mind. To justify yourself in the eyes of God, you don't think of yourself. You think of God first, then your neighbor. Well, in the case of the Jews in Jerusalem, would it have been better for Paul to just say, I ain't eating it, I don't care what y'all say? It was better for Paul to do what he did. Not only was it better for the Jews in Jerusalem, it was better for the Gentile believers also, because what did it show them? It showed them unity. If he had stood against it, it would have caused a rift. It would just, it would have tore the church up, wouldn't it? So I tend to think he was in the right what he did. Okay? All right, y'all got any questions about that? No? We're going to stop early. Lex, you want to go ahead and stop it? We're going to stop early because we're going to take the Lord's Supper. All right. Y'all go ahead and turn over to 1 Corinthians.